In this video I will break down how we can achieve this bottomless portafilter coffee simulation in Blender. I will use Flip Fluid add-on, but you can make this with Manta Flow as well, it's just much easier with Flip Fluids. First I will go over the main settings that I use in my final render, and after I will create the setup from the beginning. Parts of the coffee machine that are involved in the simulation are this handle and the filter. The handle doesn't affect the simulation much, but I did assign it as an obstacle object just in case some of the fluid goes through the filter walls. Main part is the filter that is used as an obstacle with these small holes. In my previous video you can learn how to model this. Important thing is that the geometry has some thickness, otherwise fluid will just go through it. You also have this cube that is used as a domain, and I scale it to the size where I want the simulation to happen. We will go through the exact settings that I used on the domain shortly. Now for the filter, you can add it as an obstacle object here in the Flip Fluid add-on or directly in the physics tabs under Flip Fluids. For the filter, I increased the friction to 0.9, but you can definitely experiment with this. Like I mentioned, the domain is scaled to the size where the simulation will happen, and making it bigger is not necessary and it will just increase the baking time. Underneath here we have an outflow object that will remove the fluid. As I was not planning to show the inside of the cup where the coffee is being poured to, I just placed the outflow object to remove the fluid. And for the inflow object, I borrowed the geometry from the small holes in the filter and just extruded it to give it some volume. I also animated the inflow activity to emit fluid 1 frame and then no emission for 4 to 5 frames, just to limit the amount of fluid coming in. And you can do this by adding keyframes with I while hovering over the enable checkbox here in the physics settings of the inflow object. Additionally, I have this object slightly rotating just to make sure that fluid is being emitted on the entire area of the filter. This part is not necessary and you can try without this as well. I also added these curve paths that were used as a force field to push the fluid inwards to the middle of the filter. And you want to make sure that the direction of the curve is going towards the middle. In the Flip Fluid add-on, you have the option to select force field and curve guide. The settings I used was small amount of attraction, minus 0.01, and the main one is the flow strength, and that was on 0.3. I also set the flow power to 2. Under the main, I set the resolution to 304, and I would recommend even on testing phases to use at least above 250 as the behavior of the simulation changes drastically with the lower resolution, and anything above 300 in a final render, in this case, look good. For the simulation method, I use Epic. Now, if we go under the World tab here, World Scale I changed to 13, as with the original scale, it was taking too long to bake, and I found it much easier to work with higher scales. For example, if I leave the scale to 1, you can see that it will take too many sub-steps to calculate surface tension. And you could lower the amount, but I found it easy to increase the world scale. The main settings would be viscosity and surface tension. I also enabled the sheeting effect to prevent gaps in the fluid in the thin areas. You need a small amount of viscosity and surface tension to have that effect where coffee is accumulating and flows towards the middle. I'm sure there is some right combination of these two to make this physically accurate, but it takes too long to bake each time I make changes, so I ended up using force fields. Before we talk about the material, under the advanced tab I increased the sub-steps on the minimum to 5, and like I said, I used Epic as a method of simulation. Now for the material, you will also need to activate attributes under the surface here, and you can check all of them if you want and test to see how it each looks, but in the end I ended up only using speed and lifetime. For the material, I started with the Flip Fluid coffee preset, which was just a principal BSDF with few settings to make it look like coffee, on which I added these nose to get this crema-like color. I'm not gonna go in details on this, as I'm not really happy with the material, but you can see here the nose that I use if you want to get the same result. You can also experiment with other attributes and try to get something better. Now for the lighting, I use this HDRI from Blender Kit, which is actually Polyhaven's HDRI, and I lowered the strength of it to 0.4. I also added one key light and one rim light from the back. And in the background here we have these small lights to get those small bokeh balls in the background, which is just this geometry with a little bit of emission. Camera is also parented to an empty, on which I keyframed the small rotation on the Z-axis, which gave me a little bit of panning of the camera. And finally there is one small light that is only lighting the coffee geometry as it was a little bit too dark. So if you go to the camera view and I turn off all the lights, this is how it looks with just HDRI. This is without the key light, and this is with and without the rim light. Also I used light linking for the coffee light, so it's only light in the coffee geometry. Those are pretty much all of the settings, and in the rest of the video I will play the time lapse of setting up from the start. Don't forget to like this video if it was helpful.